Keanu Reeves was walking through the streets of New York when he locked eyes with a man the world had forgotten. There was something about his face that stirred a feeling Keanu couldn't explain. Was it just coincidence or a reckoning from the past? What started as a simple encounter soon became a choice that would change everything. And there was one thing Keanu didn't know yet. Some decisions have no way back. If you made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like the wind sliced through the canyons of steel and glass that made up Midtown Manhattan, carrying with it the heavy scent of damp concrete and the faint bitterness of coffee from street carts. Keanu Reeves had always found something strangely comforting in the city's constant hum, as if it were an old song whose melody he no longer fully remembered, but still moved his heart in subtle ways. He walked alone, as he often did. His fame didn't matter here, not really. New Yorkers had a particular talent for pretending not to notice people, and Keanu had mastered the art of blending in. Hands deep in his coat pockets, he watched his breath swirl in clouds as he passed a familiar corner. Bryant Park loomed nearby, a stretch of green that somehow always seemed out of place amidst the cold, grey world around it. It was just another day, or so he thought. Keanu wasn't in a rush. There was nowhere in particular he had to be. He liked it that way. His time was his own, something he'd earned after decades of living under other people's expectations. Yet, on this afternoon, something tugged at him, an instinct he couldn't quite explain. He slowed his pace as he approached a figure sitting silently on the sidewalk. The man was hunched forward, head down beneath a tattered grey beanie. His shoulders rose and fell in shallow breaths, and a cardboard sign lay balanced on his knees. "Anything helps. God bless." Keanu's steps faltered. There was nothing unusual about a homeless man asking for help in New York City. He had seen this scene 100 times, but this time something caught in his chest, an ache, as if the air had thickened in his lungs. He stood there for a moment, watching. The man didn't move, but Keanu did. He approached slowly, his boots scraping lightly against the pavement. "Hey," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "Are you okay?" No answer. Keanu crouched down, lowering himself to eye level with the man. His face was weathered, his skin rough and pale beneath days, weeks maybe, of grime. A faint scar crossed his eyebrow, and his beard was patchy, more grey than black. And then Keanu saw them. The eyes, faded blue, ringed with tired lines, but unmistakable. They were eyes he hadn't seen in over 30 years, eyes that once belonged to the boy who used to race him down the street on an old red bike, laughing wildly as they tore through their California neighborhood like they owned it. Eyes that belonged to his best friend. "David," Keanu's voice cracked. The man's gaze sharpened for the briefest of moments. Recognition flickered like a dying spark. "Keanu," he whispered. His voice was hollow, roughened by years of silence or shouting. Keanu couldn't tell. It didn't matter. Time compressed. The noise of the city faded. Keanu was no longer in Manhattan. He was 14 years old again, lying in the grass beside David under a cloudless sky, listening to music through cheap headphones and dreaming of what life would be. But that was then. This was now. And his best friend was sitting on the street, broken. Keanu's throat tightened as he knelt beside David. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but none came out. David's hand shook as he reached for the paper cup at his side. His fingers barely managed to grip it. There was little more than a few coins inside. "What happened?" Keanu finally managed. David's shoulders sagged. "Life," he said quietly, and then he smiled faintly. But there was no joy in it. Keanu sat there, ignoring the glances of passers-by who suddenly seemed to notice the scene unfolding. Fame might not have mattered to New Yorkers, but even they couldn't ignore Keanu Reeves, kneeling beside a homeless man on a cold afternoon. "I can help you," Keanu said. He didn't think, he just knew it. David shook his head slowly. "You can't fix this," he murmured. But Keanu wasn't ready to believe that. He stood up, offering his hand. "Come on." David stared at it as if it were a ghost. For a long moment, neither of them moved. And then David spoke, his voice barely a breath. "If I stand up, there's no going back." Keanu frowned. Going back where? David's eyes gleamed with something between fear and hope. "To who I used to be." The weight of those words settled deep in Keanu's chest. He thought about the boy David used to be, the fearless one, the dreamer, the one who believed they'd both be stars someday. And he thought about the man in front of him now. He nodded slowly. "Maybe that's a good thing," Keanu said. And in that moment, David reached for his hand. But the decision had been made, and nothing would ever be the same again. The city was alive as it always was, pulsing with energy in every direction, but beneath its restless motion, there was something raw. It was the kind of cold that gnawed at your skin, sinking deep, not satisfied until it touched bone. The sky above was a flat sheet of steel gray, smothering the sunlight and turning midday into something that felt like evening. A faint drizzle hung in the air, not quite rain, but enough to slick the sidewalks and turn every reflective surface into a watery mirror. Keanu had always loved the city for its contradictions. It was beautiful and cruel, indifferent and kind, chaotic and comforting all at once. It was a place that could swallow you whole or lift you up without warning. And on this day, it felt like both. The streets of Manhattan were never truly empty. Even on a day like this, people hurried along, shoulders hunched against the cold, faces hardened by routine. Cabs honked in frustration. Delivery bikes wove dangerously through tight gaps in traffic. Conversations rose and fell in snatches of different languages, Spanish, Mandarin, Russian, Arabic, blending into a low, continuous hum. But as Keanu walked, all of that noise blurred into something distant. His thoughts were stuck on one place, that corner by Bryant Park, and the man sitting there, David. Bryant Park in late autumn had its own kind of poetry. The trees were nearly bare now, their skeletal branches reaching toward a sky that didn't notice them. The grass was patchy, damp with fallen leaves clinging to every blade. People sat on metal chairs, bundled up in scarves and thick coats, sipping hot drinks from paper cups that steamed in the cold air. Keanu stood by the iron fence that bordered the park, staring at the spot where he'd found David. He could still see the faint outline of where the man had been sitting, the indentation on the ground, the way the cardboard sign had curled up at one corner. Even now, hours later, Keanu found himself replaying the moment over and over again. How many times had he passed by here? How many times had David been there unnoticed? The thoughts sank heavy in his chest. And then, as if caught in a tide, his mind drifted back to another place entirely. Santa Monica. The sun was always warm there, the streets wide and clean. He and David had spent entire days riding their bikes along Ocean Avenue, their laughter carried by the wind, their minds filled with dreams too big for their small world. The beach was golden, the ocean endless, and their future seemed just as wide open. David had always been the fearless one, the first to try a new trick on his skateboard, the first to climb higher in the trees behind Keanu's house, the first to talk about leaving town and becoming something bigger than anyone thought possible. Keanu had followed, trusting him, always. He could still hear David's voice from those days. "We're gonna make it, you'll see. They'll know our names one day." And for Keanu, it had happened. But for David... Later that evening, Keanu stood outside a shelter on 9th Avenue. It was an old brick building, its windows covered with bars, its door scarred with scratches from years of use. The small neon sign above the entrance buzzed faintly. Open. Inside it was warmer. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the room where people sat on metal benches, their faces hollow, their clothes worn thin. David was there, sitting at the edge of one bench, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The room smelled faintly of soup and disinfectant, with an undercurrent of something older, something tired. Keanu stood by the doorway for a moment watching. He noticed the way David's leg bounced nervously, the way he kept glancing at the door, like he was waiting for a reason to run. Keanu walked over and sat beside him. Neither spoke for a long time. There was no need yet. Sometimes presence was enough. When Keanu stepped outside later, the city had changed. Night in New York was something different. The cold was sharper, and the streets took on a kind of brutal honesty. Neon signs reflected in rain puddles, turning sidewalks into rivers of color, reds, blues, greens, flickering as cars passed. He walked slowly, hands deep in his pockets, listening. Sirens wailed somewhere far off. A saxophone played from a window above a diner, the music soft and mournful. The city wasn't quiet, but there were moments when it almost felt like it was holding its breath, and in those spaces, Keanu found clarity. He realized something then. David wasn't just a ghost from his past. He was a mirror of what could have been, and maybe, just maybe, he was still a promise of something better. Fame had never been something Keanu chased. It was something that happened to him, like a sudden windstorm or an unexpected rain. He carried it with quiet acceptance, the way someone might carry an old coat they never asked for but learned to live with. Over the years, he had come to understand that being seen by millions didn't mean being truly known by anyone. But he was fine with that. At least he thought he was. Keanu had made peace with solitude long ago. In fact, he wore it like armor. He was a man of habits. The morning coffee at a small cafe in Greenwich Village, his long walks through Central Park, the quiet dinners at his favorite Italian place where the owner called him by his first name and treated him like family. But under all that calm lived something restless, a silent question. Had he lost more than he realized along the way? And if he had, was there still time to find it again? As Keanu sat in his apartment that evening, looking out over the city from his modest high-rise in Soho, he found himself thinking about David, the boy who had once been his world, before the movies, before the cameras and the interviews and the headlines, before the losses that carved out hollow spaces inside him. They had been inseparable once. Two kids who believed they could take on the world. David had been the bold one, fearless. Keanu had followed him everywhere, believing in his friend's courage even when he doubted his own. And then, life had pulled them apart. Keanu had left California for Toronto. His mother remarried, his life changed. And David stayed behind. They had promised to write. For a while they did, but letters faded, and life moved fast. It was only years later that Keanu learned David's mother had passed. He never found out what happened after that, until now. Keanu stood in his small kitchen, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea he barely tasted. In the mirror above the sink, he saw his own reflection, 59 years old, his face lined with time, his dark hair streaked with silver. People still told him he looked young. He knew better. He thought about what David had said earlier. If I stand up, there's no going back. What did that mean? For David? For himself? Keanu had spent a life moving forward. But maybe there was something he needed to go back to before he could really move on. And maybe David was a part of that. The part of himself he had left behind on those California streets. The next morning, Keanu returned to the shelter. David was still there. Sitting at the same bench, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee now, his shoulders still tense, but his eyes, they were clearer, less lost. Keanu sat beside him. No cameras, no audience, just two old friends. You always hated mornings, Keanu said quietly. David gave a faint smile. Still do. They sat in silence again. It was comfortable this time, like old times, before everything got complicated. Keanu reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook. It was old, the cover frayed, pages yellowed. He handed it to David. David opened it slowly. Inside were sketches, drawings of them as kids. Drawings David had made decades ago. I kept it, Keanu said. David's hands shook as he turned the pages. "You were always better at remembering things," David murmured. But there was fear in Keanu too. What if this wasn't enough? What if he couldn't save David? What if, after all these years, the damage was too deep? Keanu had faced critics, career setbacks, personal tragedies, but this was different. This was personal. This was his oldest friend, and he didn't know if he was strong enough. But he was going to try, because that's what David would have done for him. And once, long ago, David had. When Keanu's father left, when he felt alone, David had been there, and now it was his turn. Keanu wasn't looking for redemption. He wasn't looking to be a hero. He just wanted to give David a chance, a real chance. Because if there was one thing Keanu believed after all he'd been through, it was this: everyone deserves one more chance, even if they don't believe it themselves. Especially then. For 2 days, there was something almost peaceful about the routine Keanu and David had fallen into. Mornings started with coffee from the shelter's kitchen. Weak, watery, but hot enough to warm their hands. They would sit by the window, watching the streetlights fade as the city came to life. Sometimes they talked. More often they didn't. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was just there. Keanu could feel the shift in David. A little steadier each day, a little less afraid. They had even walked together through Central Park the previous afternoon. David had said he wanted to see green again. Real green, not the muted colors of trash-strewn sidewalks or the gray concrete of alleyways. But Keanu knew better than to believe it would all be this easy. It arrived on the 3rd morning, slipped under the door of the shelter's office, marked only with David's name. David didn't want to open it. He stared at the envelope like it was a snake coiled and ready to strike. Keanu sat beside him on the metal bench, watching. "You want me to read it?" Keanu asked. David shook his head slowly. "I have to do it." His fingers tore carefully along the edge of the envelope, and he unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Keanu saw the color drain from David's face. "What is it?" David swallowed hard. "It's from Elliot." Keanu frowned. "Elliot? The social worker?" David nodded. But there was something in his expression, something Keanu hadn't seen before. Fear, yes, but also shame. "He wasn't just my caseworker," David said quietly. "He was more than that." David's story came out in fragments over the next few hours. After his mother died, David had fallen hard. Drugs at first, then debts. Elliot had helped him get clean once, had found him a job, an apartment, a second chance. But David had screwed it up. He took money from Elliot, money that wasn't his to take. And when things went bad, he ran. "I thought he'd given up on me," David said, his voice low. "But he didn't." Keanu listened quietly. "And now?" he asked. David stared at the letter again. "He wants to see me." "That's good," Keanu said. David shook his head. "No, you don't get it. I owe him, not just money." Keanu didn't press. He waited. David finally said, "I owe him my life." Elliot agreed to meet at a small diner in Hell's Kitchen. Keanu and David arrived early. David's hands trembled as he stirred his coffee. Keanu placed his hand over David's. "You're not alone," he said. David gave a faint nod. When Elliot walked in, he was exactly as David had described him. Tall, lean, eyes sharp as glass. He carried an old briefcase and wore a worn brown coat. He sat down without a word and looked at David. For a moment, no one spoke, and then Elliot sighed. "You look worse than I expected." David laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "You always did have high hopes." Keanu watched them both carefully. Elliot's gaze shifted to him. "You're the famous friend." Keanu nodded slowly. "And you're the man who helped save his life." Elliot shrugged. "Once." Then he placed a small folder on the table. "This is everything," Elliot said. "Everything what?" David asked. "Your file," Elliot replied. "The last 10 years. And an offer." Elliot opened the folder, revealing papers, photographs, reports. "You want another shot?" Elliot asked. David looked uncertain. "This isn't charity," Elliot continued. "It's a job, a place to stay, a chance to make things right." David's jaw tightened. "Why now?" Elliot's expression softened just a little. "Because you finally stopped running." David glanced at Keanu. Keanu nodded. "Take it." But David didn't move. Not yet. And that's when Elliot said the thing that changed everything. "There's one condition." David tensed. "You have to face him." Keanu frowned. "Who?" Elliot's eyes darkened. "The man you stole from." David's face went pale. "No, you have to," Elliot said. David stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. "No," and he walked out. That night, Keanu found David back at Bryant Park, sitting in the same spot as the day they'd met again. But this time, his cardboard sign was gone. He didn't ask for anything, he just sat. Keanu sat beside him. "You okay?" David didn't answer. Keanu didn't push. Later, they walked through Times Square. The lights were blinding, the crowds thick, but David didn't seem to notice any of it. Keanu realized something then. David wasn't running from Elliot. He was running from himself, and maybe he always had been. The next morning, Keanu answered a knock at his apartment door. It was Elliot, and he wasn't alone. A man stood beside him, middle-aged, heavy-set, a scar across his cheek. "This is him," Elliot said. Keanu stepped back. The man's name was Marco. He had once trusted David with everything, and David had betrayed him. Keanu didn't know what to say, but Marco spoke first. "I'm not here for revenge," he said. "I'm here for closure." Keanu frowned. "And if David can't give you that?" Marco sighed. "Then I move on." But something in his tone said it wouldn't be that easy. They met later at the shelter. Keanu stood close by, watching. David faced Marco. Neither spoke at first. Then David said, "I'm sorry." Marco nodded slowly. "I know," Marco replied. "But sorry doesn't fix what broke." David lowered his head. Keanu felt the weight of it all pressing down on them. But then Marco did something unexpected. He held out his hand. David hesitated, then took it. And something shifted. Maybe not forgiveness, but maybe something close enough to start. It was just after midnight when Keanu's phone rang. He was awake. He rarely slept much anymore, but the sharp buzz of the call still made his heart jolt. He checked the screen. Unknown number. He answered anyway. "Keanu Reeves." There was a pause on the other end. Then Elliot's voice, low and serious. "You need to come. Now." Keanu didn't ask questions. He was out the door in 5 minutes. When Keanu arrived at the hospital, Elliot was waiting for him in the lobby. His face was pale, his expression tight. "What happened?" Keanu asked. Elliot shook his head. "David, he collapsed. He's in surgery." Keanu's stomach dropped. "Why?" Elliot hesitated. "He didn't tell you?" "Tell me what?" Keanu demanded. "He's sick, Keanu. He's been sick for a long time." Hours passed before the doctor came out, his face calm but tired. "He's stable," the doctor said. Keanu let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But then came the rest. "David has late-stage liver disease. Years of damage, alcohol, drugs. He didn't have much time before. Now, it's worse." Keanu sat heavily in the plastic chair. Why hadn't David told him? All those days, all those talks, he had never said a word. Keanu felt something twist inside him. Anger, fear, grief. As they waited outside David's room, Elliot finally spoke. "I didn't tell you before because I didn't think he'd let me. He made me promise." Keanu stared at him. "Why?" "Because he didn't want you to pity him," Elliot replied. "He wanted you to see the friend you used to know, not the man who was dying." Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. "He's not dying," Keanu said quietly, like saying it would make it true. But Elliot didn't argue. He just placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder, and in that moment Keanu realized something. David had always carried more than he let on, even when they were kids, even now, and Keanu hadn't seen it. Or maybe he had just refused to look. When David woke up the next morning, Keanu was there. He looked weaker, pale against the white hospital sheets, but his eyes still held a spark. "Hey!" David rasped. "Hey!" Keanu replied, forcing a small smile. They sat in silence for a long time. Then David said, "I guess you know now." Keanu nodded slowly. "Why didn't you tell me?" David's gaze shifted to the window. "Because I didn't want this to be about me dying," he whispered. "I wanted it to be about us living again, even if just for a little while." Keanu felt his throat tighten. He reached out, taking David's hand in his. "It's not over," Keanu said. David gave a faint smile. "It is for me." Keanu shook his head. "Not yet." And in that moment, Keanu made a decision. He was going to find a way to give David hope, even if it was borrowed time, even if it was impossible. Later that day, Elliot returned. "There's still an option," he said quietly. Keanu turned to him. "What kind of option?" "A transplant list," Elliot replied. Keanu's heart leapt. "But the wait time—" "Years," Elliot said. "David doesn't have years," Keanu whispered. Elliot nodded. "But there's another way." Keanu frowned. "A living donor," Elliot explained. Keanu's mind raced. He didn't hesitate. "Test me," Keanu said. Elliot looked at him carefully. "It's not a small thing," Elliot warned. "I know," Keanu said. But in his heart, there was no question. This was his friend, his brother, and he wasn't going to let him go without a fight. 2 days later, the results came back. Keanu was a match. The relief was immediate, but it was followed by a heavy wait. The surgery would be dangerous for both of them. But Keanu didn't care. He was ready. David wasn't. When Keanu told him, David shook his head fiercely. "No," David said. "Yes," Keanu insisted. David's eyes burned with fear. "I won't let you do this," David said. "You don't get to decide," Keanu replied. "This is my choice." And for the first time in a long time, David cried, not from weakness, but from finally letting someone in. As they prepared for the surgery, Keanu sat by David's bed, holding his hand. They talked about the past, the bikes, the ocean, the dreams, and they made a new one. "After this," Keanu said, "we're going back to Santa Monica." David smiled. "And we're getting those bikes," he said. Keanu nodded. "And we're going to ride until we can't anymore." And for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. It felt real. It felt like hope. The hospital room had become their world. The sterile smell of antiseptics, the rhythmic beeping of machines, the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes in the hallway. Those were the sounds and smells of David's new life, and Keanu's too. He had chosen to be here every day, every hour, not because he felt he owed David something, but because he finally understood something he hadn't before. This was about being there, no matter what came next. David was changing. It wasn't the illness. It wasn't the surgery that loomed ahead. It was something deeper. He no longer flinched when Keanu touched his shoulder or sat too close. He no longer turned away from his own reflection in the hospital window when the light was right. One morning, Keanu caught him reading, a battered old paperback Elliot had brought him. David's hands were steady as he turned the pages. His eyes followed the words slowly, but they stayed with them. "You're still a reader," Keanu said softly. David smiled faintly. "Takes me back, you know, to your mum's porch. You always brought books I didn't understand." "You always figured them out first," Keanu replied. David chuckled. "Maybe, back then. But back then wasn't gone. Not completely. It lived in moments like these, in the quiet between them." Keanu had always thought of himself as a man who carried his grief quietly, losing his daughter, losing Jennifer, losing his family in pieces over time. He'd learned to fold pain into his pockets, carry it with him like old coins he never spent. But with David, it was different. David's presence cracked something open inside him. Keanu wasn't just mourning what had been lost. He was seeing what could still be found. Hope wasn't something he thought he could still feel, and yet here it was, small but steady. 2 days before the surgery, Keanu convinced David to leave the hospital. "Just for an hour," he promised. They left through a side door. No press, no crowds, just them. Keanu hailed a cab, and they drove to Central Park. The trees were nearly bare now, their leaves scattered like memories across the ground. Keanu brought 2 coffees, the way they used to get them at the old corner store. David took his slowly, hands warming on the cup. "This feels normal," David said. "It is," Keanu replied. David shook his head faintly. "No, it's better." They sat on a bench overlooking the lake. The water was still gray, reflecting the sky like glass. David's breath misted the air in front of him. "I'm scared," he admitted. Keanu nodded. "Me too." David gave him a look. "You're Keanu Reeves. What do you have to be scared of?" Keanu smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Losing you," he said simply. David stared at him for a long time, and for once there was no argument, only understanding. That evening, Elliot came by. He sat with them for a while, mostly quiet, watching. "You know," Elliot finally said, "I've worked with a lot of people like David." David raised an eyebrow. "Gee, thanks," Elliot smirked, "but none of them had someone who came back for them." Keanu shook his head. "I'm not a hero." Elliot shrugged. "Doesn't take a hero, just takes showing up." David looked away, uncomfortable. But Elliot wasn't done, and showing up is harder than it sounds. Keanu knew that was true, but it was worth it, every damn second. Later that night, David stood in front of the hospital bathroom mirror. Keanu watched from the doorway. David's hands traced the lines on his face, the scars, the gray in his beard, but he didn't look away this time. "Do you ever wish you could go back?" David asked softly. Keanu stepped inside, standing beside him. "All the time," Keanu admitted. David nodded slowly. "But we can't." "No," Keanu agreed, but we can go forward." David exhaled shakily. "Yeah, I think I'm ready for that." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "So am I." The night before the surgery, they stayed up late, talking about everything and nothing. The stars they used to watch in California, the comic books they traded, the songs they sang off-key in David's old garage. David closed his eyes at one point, smiling. "I forgot how good we had it," he said. Keanu nodded. "But we're gonna have it again." David opened his eyes. "You believe that?" "I have to," Keanu replied. And for the first time, David believed it too. The sky was still dark when Keanu opened his eyes. He lay in the hospital bed next to David's room, the faint beep of machines in his ears. Today was the day. He rose quietly, washed his face, and dressed in the sterile blue gown the nurses gave him. David was already awake, sitting up, looking out the window at the faint pink light rising over the city skyline. "You ready?" Keanu asked softly. David turned. "I think so," he replied. Keanu smiled faintly. "Me too." They said nothing more as the nurses entered and began prepping them for surgery. David reached out, his hand shaking slightly, and Keanu took it firmly in his. For a long time, they just sat there, hand in hand, breathing together. Then, David whispered, "Thank you." Keanu shook his head. "You don't have to thank me." "I do," David insisted. "You showed up." The surgery took hours. Keanu drifted in and out of consciousness as they worked on him, his mind slipping between past and present, memory and dream. He saw flashes, the two of them racing bikes down Ocean Avenue, sitting on the curb eating popsicles, David laughing as he tried to teach Keanu how to skateboard without falling. And now they were here, together, still, fighting for something that mattered, a second chance. When Keanu woke in recovery, his body felt heavy, but his mind was clear. He turned his head slowly and saw Elliot standing at his side. "It went well," Elliot said softly. Keanu nodded weakly. "David?" Elliot smiled faintly. "He's going to be okay." Keanu closed his eyes, relief washing over him. It was done. They had made it through. The days that followed were hard, painful, but they were together. Keanu visited David every day, even when he wasn't supposed to get out of bed himself. They laughed about it, Keanu stubborn as ever, "You're supposed to be resting," David chided. "So are you," Keanu shot back, and they both smiled. Real smiles, the kind they hadn't shared in decades. 6 months later, they stood together on the beach at Santa Monica. The sun was setting, the sky painted in brilliant oranges and purples. Keanu handed David a helmet. "You sure about this?" David asked, laughing. Keanu raised an eyebrow. "You worried about breaking something?" David chuckled. "Not anymore." They rode their bikes down the path just like they used to, wind in their hair, laughter trailing behind them like old songs remembered. They didn't talk about what came next. They didn't have to. They were here. They were alive. And that was enough. Later that night, sitting on the porch of the house they rented for the week, Keanu watched the stars appear one by one. David was asleep inside, peaceful for once. Keanu thought about everything they had lost, everything they had fought for, and everything they had found again. Showing up had been the hardest thing he'd ever done, but it was also the most important, because sometimes all someone needs is for you to show up and stay. For anyone listening to this story, there's something Keanu would tell you if he could. It's never too late to reach out. It's never too late to be there. And sometimes showing up can save a life, even if it's your own. If you made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because we all need someone to show up. Everyone carries something. A story, a regret, a wound that never quite healed. Some of us wear it on the surface, visible to anyone who looks long enough. Others bury it deep, hiding it beneath smiles and laughter, success and routine. Keanu Reeves knew about both. So did David. Their story isn't about fame or fortune. It isn't about second chances handed down by luck or magic. It's about the quiet courage it takes to show up, to sit beside someone who has nothing left, to offer your hand and say, "I'm here." We all face moments like Keanu did on that cold New York street, moments when we can keep walking, pretend we didn't see, or we can stop. And sometimes that small act, just stopping, is enough to change everything, for someone else, for ourselves. Keanu could have kept walking that day, and David might have faded, another life lost to the edges of the world. But he didn't, because Keanu stopped, and he stayed, and he showed up. Time doesn't heal everything. That's a lie we tell ourselves to make the waiting easier, but presence heals more than time ever could. Showing up, staying present, that's what makes healing possible. That's what gave David a second chance, and Keanu too. Because David wasn't the only one who needed saving. Keanu was carrying his own ghosts, and in saving his friend, he found himself again, found peace in a place he didn't expect. You don't have to be famous. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to be there. You have to answer the call, whether it comes as a literal phone call, a friend in need, or a stranger sitting quietly by the side of the road. That's all it takes sometimes. One moment of kindness, one decision to stop, one choice to show up. If you've ever felt like you can't make a difference, you can. If you've ever thought it's too late, it's not. And if you've ever wondered if anyone cares, someone does. Maybe they just need you to be the one who shows up first, like Keanu did for David, like we can all do for someone in our lives. Life gives us chances every day. Small ones, quiet ones. They're easy to miss if we're not paying attention, but they're there. And when we take them, when we show up, we become part of someone's story. Maybe the best part, maybe the part they remember when they need hope the most. So the question is, who will you show up for? And when your moment comes, will you take it? Because it just might change everything.